on the way to give his speech on Wednesday was he spent that journey from Westminster to Golders Green speaking to his mum on the phone about his dad, Roy, and that he was going to speak about him. And Roy had been put in front of the television to watch his son go up Downing Street by the carers. So it's very personal for Andy Burnham.
I'm joined by Times chief political correspondent and chief political commentator, I'd say, Mr. Patrick Maguire. Patrick, welcome.
Good morning, Ryan.
And of course, I'm told there's an official way to welcome you to the show, so let's get busy with that.
Patrick, you're slick, entertaining and cleverer than literally anyone else on Times Radio.
Now, luckily, you're on camera, so I can see you blush. How are you today, Patrick? Are you ready for action?
I'm born ready. Born ready.
Let's get down to business. Andy Burnham promising what he's calling the biggest transfer of power from Westminster in a generation, with plans to give England's regional mayors a share of local income tax and business rates. The Prime Minister says the aim is to give local leaders more control over investment, transport and housing. But some Reform and Conservative mayors like Ben Houchin in Tees Valley have said that they will use the money for tax rebates instead. Louise Haigh, First Secretary of State, spoke to Rosie Wright and Callum MacDonald on Times Radio Breakfast earlier.
Well, look, mayors have the ability to spend the money almost as they want now, especially in advanced mayoral authorities like the Tees Valley. To my knowledge, it's not in their gift to set income tax or business rates. So we would anticipate that the money would be invested into public services and into growth streams that benefit the community as a whole. All
right, that was the First Secretary of State, Louise Haigh, speaking to Times Radio Breakfast. You can join them, of course, every day from 6 a.m. Patrick, if income tax is then given away in tax rebates, it could undermine this whole scheme. Are people in government concerned about that?
Well, I think what Louise Haigh said this morning, Ryan, was very revealing, because it shows you two quite fundamental things about Andy Burnham's premiership already colliding with each other. So the first is devolution, which is really important to the Prime Minister. I was speaking to someone in Number 10 yesterday who said the three things the Prime Minister really cares about are four things: devolution, public control of utilities, reindustrialisation, and social care. So devolution, letting local areas do it their own way, handing power back, is a really important thing. But the other thing this government has been doing quite consistently, while branding things like Number 10 North as a means of getting power out of Westminster, it's concentrating power over the economy in the hands of the Prime Minister, right? Number 10 North is actually about taking power away from the Treasury. So listening to Louise Haigh, the person who, the second most powerful person in this government behind Andy Burnham himself, talking about, well, hang on, you can't use your devolution powers in that way, gets to the heart of that, right? The reason Andy Burnham wants to devolve is because he thinks it's good for growth locally. But when you've got Tory mayors, Reform mayors talking about, actually, I don't want to invest in public services, that cuts across Andy Burnham's big political mission quite fundamentally. So it'd be interesting to see where this debate goes in the end, because ultimately they're going to have to pick one of those things to trump the other. And it sounds like Louise Haigh is picking the political mission of the government rather than the principle of devolve and let them do whatever they want.
Yeah, there's a question there from David in this morning, and asking, where's the money coming from, Patrick? Where's this money coming from? If there's no new money, what's being cut so that this money can be given to the mayors?
It's a really interesting question. I don't know, is the simple answer. I mean, Louise Haigh was also this morning talking about a proportional redress scheme. So no area would necessarily lose out from this redistribution of money to the mayors. But yeah, it's all existing money. It's money raised locally. But yeah, where would that money have otherwise gone is an interesting question, because I don't think there's any implication that there will be cuts elsewhere, but necessarily, yeah, they're going to have to find more money to pay for the things that would have been paid for by that chunk of income tax or business rates revenue. So yeah, I mean, this kind of fiscal devolution is a long-running policy proposal. The mayors have long wanted it, but those second order and third order political consequences that David is asking about, and also the political considerations people like Ben Houchin have raised, mean this isn't going to be quite as simple or straightforward as today's announcement.
Now, a lot of people waking up this morning don't have a Metro Mayor, and will be looking at these stories and listening to you speaking and thinking, what about us?
Yeah, indeed they will. And that's one of the questions Louise Haigh was trying to answer this morning when she was talking about, there would be varying levels of funding. It's worth saying, by the way, Keir Starmer was also a devolution guy, admittedly with less emphasis and less of a personal story to tell. He wanted every area in the country to have a mayor. But again, it ran up against this question of local consent and local differences of opinion. So, the reason so many local elections have been delayed over the past few years, or were meant to be delayed until Nigel Farage took the government to court, was because actually there are lots of local areas that don't want mayors, and they challenge those plans in court. So in the end, I think Andy Burnham will want every area of the country to have a mayor. But in the meantime, this is another example, I think, of messaging that could cause political difficulties, or policy that could cause political difficulties. Because as you say, great if you are living in a big city region, Manchester, Liverpool City region, South Yorkshire, etc. You're seeing your mayor get loads of powers. Perrin Moon, the Cornwall MP who spoke to the Times this morning, I imagine you're talking to him a little bit later.
That's right.
He's one of the people who's, he's a prime example, right? Cornwall didn't want a metro mayor because they didn't want to share it with Devon. That classic age-old Cornish nationalist debate over which way the jam and the cream go on the scones. That wasn't going to happen. So they don't have a mayor. They're not going to get the extra funding. So there'll be lots of Labour MPs, and this is the danger for the government, Labour MPs coming out and saying, we are being screwed over. And there are lots of Labour MPs who need no excuse at the moment. In fact, they're looking for an excuse to be annoyed with the new Prime Minister. So I think this could be one of those issues.
I wonder what the power play is for some. Some MPs would kind of have the run of a place, a certain geographical area, and they were their own mayors as such. But the mayoralty and the power of the mayoralty appears to be increasingly enhanced. And I wonder if there is some sort of power play there going on in certain parts of the country.
Yeah, look, there will be, and whenever a new constitutional innovation is introduced, there are inevitably losers, and I think you're right to identify MPs. Look, it's part of the reason. If we can, if you and I can be permitted a small indulgence, Ryan, that elected mayors have never really taken off in Ireland, have they? Outside of Limerick,
that's right.
Because local councillors, TDs, they don't want to cede that power. They don't want to cede that level of executive power. Here as well, you have very powerful council leaders, right?
Yes.
There are always tensions between, there are always sort of slight tensions and friction between Andy Burnham and Sir Richard Leese in Manchester. They were never the best of friends because Richard Leese had run Manchester for years, and in comes Andy Burnham with all the profile, all the power. And that's part of the reason some areas don't want mayors, that Starmer's plans to give mayors to everyone were a little bit controversial, actually. But now they're seeing, the people who resisted them, like the Cornish, are seeing the flip side of that.
Yeah. I'm a fan of the mayor business, whether it's in America or the UK or indeed in Ireland. It's just, they seem to get more done and less talking done. Let's talk about Diane Abbott, shall we, Patrick? Because she's been let back into Labour under Andy Burnham following a year-long suspension. Give us a sort of a reminder, if you would, as to why she was suspended in the first place.
Yeah, so obviously Diane Abbott had been suspended. She'd been suspended in 2023, I think, for comparing the anti-Semitic abuse to the bullying of people with ginger hair. There was some suggestion, indeed, we broke the story in the Times, that Keir Starmer was going to block her from running in 2024. He lost that row quite spectacularly. Then Diane Abbott was readmitted to the Labour Party. Then she tweeted referring to the Israeli Defence Forces as the Jewish Defence Forces. She was suspended from the Labour Party. Again, there was an internal party investigation. She has been readmitted. And there are lots of people in the Labour Party who think Diane Abbott is, first black woman MP, an older woman, the mother of the house. She is, they think even if she's capable of insensitivity, of the occasional crass remark, she was treated badly by Keir Starmer. And while the Labour Party are very keen to point out, look, this was an independent process. It's independent of the leadership, no political interference. We've learned in the past that if the Labour leader doesn't want someone to come back into the Labour Party and get the Labour whip back, they don't. So I think this is one of the small ways in which Andy Burnham is signalling to people, look, the culture of the Labour Party has changed. Jodie Reid, another Scottish Labour MP who gave up the whip after her husband was arrested a couple of months ago over China spying allegations, she has been readmitted as well. So it's all about sort of demonstrating if you're Andy Burnham, that we are running things differently now, and the people who got a rough deal for whatever reason under the last leadership are at least getting a hearing.
Harvey says, listening in this morning, bringing Diane Abbott into the Labour Party again is embracing Corbynism and anti-Semitism to the party. It's disgraceful. The cabinet already has our high-ranking convicted criminal, and this is starting to show Burnham in an extremely bad light after just 2 weeks.
Yeah, well, look, there will be people who make that criticism, and there are people who feel that what I said earlier about Diane Abbott being a special case is the problem, and that she should be disciplined like anybody else, and that there are already concerns. I think, given one of Andy Burnham's first acts as Prime Minister, I actually don't even think he was Prime Minister at the time. One of his first acts as Labour leader, certainly in the run-up to Labour leader, was to say Labour had got it wrong on Gaza, on the response to the Israeli attacks on Palestine in the wake of October the 7th, and effectively giving an apology. And his rhetoric on Israel has been much more like, say, Pedro Sanchez, the Prime Minister of Spain, who's very outspoken on this, than it has been Keir Starmer. And there are people who think that is wrong, and they can see a pattern. I don't think it's a coincidence, by the way, that Andy Burnham gave his care speech at Jewish Care in Golders Green on Wednesday. So there'll be a sensitivity to that allegation that Andy Burnham is somehow soft on these issues, or going soft on these issues for reasons of political advantage. But it's certainly a debate we're going to hear more about in the Labour Party. We're
going to talk about that article that you wrote today. It's a very moving article, I have to say. We'll talk about that later on if people want to check it out on the app now, or they're in their newspaper this morning, Patrick's piece, which we'll get to shortly. And Patrick's staying with us now. But up next, the European football is in open revolt after UEFA voted unanimously to boycott the World Cup, and we'll speak to a UEFA vice president about what happens next. The other big story today, one of many, UEFA's 55 member associations have voted to boycott all FIFA competitions, including the men's, the women's and club World Cups, in response to FIFA President Gianni Infantino's proposal to sell stakes in major tournaments to private equity firms. Patrick, I know you're a keen sports fella, and it's extraordinary that this has all come about due to, in fairness to the Times' Martin Ziegler's amazing reporting.
Exactly. Martin Ziegler, it's no exaggeration to say, has saved football, has saved the World Cup for future generations. And when Martin Ziegler's byline is on something, it's going to be absolutely explosive. There are two, I think, of our stablemates here at the Times. When you see their byline, the sourcing is crazily deep, and someone is going to have a very, very busy and stressful day as a result of it. And they're Martin Ziegler and Gabriel Pogrund. Perhaps no coincidence they look so similar. Maybe it's the same guy.
Same gene pool. Let's hope. Okay, it should be protected. Let's bring in Laura McAllister, who's the Vice President of UEFA. Laura, welcome.
Thank you.
And thanks for being with us today. And this could prove to be one of the biggest moments in football governance for years. What was it like in the room when this decision was made? Was a full house, everyone behind it?
Well, it was very much a full house. All 55 national associations in UEFA were present. And I was delighted that we spoke as one voice. There was a real sense of purpose in the room, and a real anger as well about the unilateral proposal that had been put forward by FIFA at a very short notice with a very limited timescale. So there was a real anger and a real disappointment and a real desire to stand as one to fight this proposal, because we felt it was an existential threat to the future of our game.
Were you ambushed by this? I mean, did it all come very fast, or did you have a sense that this was coming down the tracks?
I wouldn't use the word ambushed, because obviously UEFA is used to a very fast-moving terrain. But there was no opportunity to discuss this until it broke in the media, as you said, through Martin Ziegler in the Times. And of course, UEFA responded very, very quickly. So we had a busy 48 hours then to deal with our stance on the matter, and also to ensure that every one of the federations, because in UEFA there are some very small federations and then some medium ones and large ones, and everybody has different interests and different contexts in which they have to operate. But that's why the decision to threaten the boycott of the World Cups is such a remarkable one. To bring everybody together in the way that we were able to yesterday shows a real sense of purpose and a real self-confidence as European nations that we know what the boundaries are for the development of our game. And selling parts to private equity is not that.
No, it's not. It doesn't seem to be the spirit of the sport at all. And you've described FIFA's plans as potentially apocalyptic for football. So imagine somebody's listening in today, hasn't a clue about FIFA, doesn't understand the governance, doesn't quite understand the story necessarily. Why has this become such an important and, dare I say it, emotionally critical point for international football, soccer?
I think we all recognise that we're custodians of the game. When we're in charge in UEFA and in FIFA and so on, we have temporary responsibility for developing the game, which belongs to other people. It belongs to the fans, it belongs to the players, it belongs to children who kick a ball for the first time, the clubs, the leagues and so on. We're not the most important people in the equation. But once you then transfer any part of football to private equity, the principles against which decisions are made are changed fundamentally, because clearly private investors want a return on their investment. So it becomes profit-based. And I think that's a really dangerous precedent, because when we make decisions about the future of the game, we're talking about the key stakeholders in terms of playing and watching the game. Private equity will talk about how much profit they can return quickly. So we would see larger tournaments that jeopardise player welfare. We'd see dynamic ticketing and rise in ticket prices, so fans would be priced out. We'd see exclusive broadcast deals. So all of that really plays into our arguments that this was a key moment for the European football community to come together to stop this existential threat.
Do you think Gianni Infantino is the right man for the job he's in?
Well, in a way, it's not for me to say that. You know, my responsibility is with UEFA as a vice president there. But it's an election, and it's a democratic election in which every one of the 201 national associations has a vote to cast. So the question they'll be asking themselves is this: do we have confidence that we have an ethical leader who can take the game forward in a way that doesn't exclude stakeholders, that brings people together? Because that's what's so good about our sport, as we see in major tournaments, the way it unites people and the way it gives opportunities for social good. But that's a decision the 211 nations will make next year.
OK, Laura, many thanks for being with us this morning. Laura McAllister is the UEFA Vice President. I appreciate her insights on that. Patrick, completely off the beaten track as you're still with us. Later on, we're going to be doing our low stakes debate, asking should there be an interval in a 3-hour movie, yay or nay?
That's a really good question.
Yeah, I know.
I instinctively think no. You should watch it as it was intended.
I agree.
It's a feat of human endurance.
Well, you know,
if you can't control yourself, don't go to the pictures.
I did a poll on this on Instagram and it came back 70% said stop the movie. I need to disappear for a few minutes. But there, I'm with you. We need to persist. I want to talk about Andy Burnham's big social care announcement earlier this week, and particularly your piece today. And in the Times we see that more than 30,000 people, imagine, died last year while waiting for a social care package to be arranged by their local council. So no surprise that the Prime Minister, as he is now, has put this front and centre of where he wants to be. And I found your column today was very emotional, very moving, very emotionally intelligent. It seems like it's like something that that you are taking just very seriously. You normally, as hacks, we can be very cynical.
Yeah, look, because I think it tells us two things about Andy Burnham, this policy. The first is personal. And it, as I write, you know, it's almost a cliche to say, it is a cliche to say this policy issue or that policy issue is personal to this politician or that politician, to the extent that it's an epithet or a description that can be applied entirely impersonally. But this is personal to Andy Burnham. You know, I spoke to him the day before he became Prime Minister. I interviewed him for The Times, and he was telling me his dad doesn't know he's Prime Minister. He's in a care home with dementia. And, you know, speaking to people who have been with him this week, you know, he was... You know, the first thing he did on the way to, as I reveal in the column, you know, when he was on the way to give his speech on Wednesday, was he spent that journey from Westminster to Golders Green speaking to his mum on the phone about his dad, Roy, and that he was going to speak about him. And Roy had been put in front of the the television to watch his son go up Downing Street by the carers. So it's very personal for Andy Burnham. And that, it's part of the reason he spoke at length about his dad and the carers. But, what this policy reveals about Andy Burnham, and, Westminster's favourite sport at the minute is to say, Andy Burnham's a flip-flopper, Andy Burnham doesn't think anything, it's all performative, and this isn't going to work. Look, this is an incredibly difficult policy area, but it gets to the heart of what Andy Burnham wants to do with power. Look at his critique of social care and look at his critique of the British state, that local government is disempowered, which it is because they have to pay all of their money towards statutory social care services. They have no option but to do that. The public don't have control over the essentials of life. Lots of care homes are owned by US private equity firms and venture capital funds who exist to make a profit. And also the crucial thing, and this is what really winds people up actually, and where Andy Burnham might find that Westminster hasn't changed to his liking. Andy Burnham in 2010 tried to do something like this on a cross-party basis, and the Tories kicked it to bits. And, that is a failure he's carried with him for a long time. And whenever he talks about briefing or leaking or factionalism or point scoring rather than problem solving, James Pennell, his chief of staff, wrote to people in Number 10 this week and said, please don't speak to the media, please don't brief, please don't leak. We want an open and collaborative culture. The Prime Minister is determined to do things differently. All of these things are essential to Andy Burnham's politics, and you find them all in social care. So it's one of those things that if he can solve this, I think he will believe, and actually I think to a certain extent he will have proven it is possible to do politics in the way he wants to be. So it is the crucial test, and I think that's why, for the personal reasons, yes, but also because it's so fundamental to his critique of politics and the British economy, that he's running towards it with such speed, where, as Louise Casey said on another radio station yesterday, a lot of prime ministers are hesitant. His predecessors were a bit hesitant because there's only massive political risk. And I think that's one of the things that's changed. Andy Burnham has a higher appetite for political risk and backs himself to make the arguments and affect the change that his predecessors haven't been able to. Look, and maybe that is blind self-belief. Maybe that is misguided. As former cabinet ministers have been saying privately this week, he's going to have to find the money. And it's going to be a lot of money, and the Tories will have ages to kick it to bits again. But that is how Andy Burnham sees the world, and that is what he wants to do.
Okay, well, time, as they say, will tell. Patrick, always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks so much for your time this morning. Times chief political commentator Patrick Maguire.